we're a few minutes late, I'm going to go ahead and start up our reading today. As always, thank all of you for joining us. This is the Losing Guattari Quarantine Collective and our ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We may be finishing today. We may have a handful of paragraphs left over. We are going until it looks like probably about 2:30 my time. The recording is on as of a few moments ago. Yes, Roger. Should have announced. Sorry. Let's see. On the chopping block for quick announcements, we are going to have the mods and admins are having a chat later today about kind of the future of what we're doing on the server and plans. Please, if you have ideas on next text, other readings, ideas for us at large, don't hesitate to toss them into the suggestions channel. We are looking to do some larger projects next year, which is going to be exciting. So we're going to have some talks on that, and we'll be able to talk more about that in the new year, which is just a few days away. We usually do most of our announcements on Monday. Please check our calendar up above, and you can see what else we're doing on the server. There is a ton. On here, our partner server, the Continental Philosophy server. We've got a lot of shit going on, but the biggest thing is going to be Anti-Oedipus, of course. So unless anyone has anything, speak now, forever hold your peace. I'll continue moving on. All right. I believe we were at the bottom of 374, if one keeps in mind. Excellent. If one keeps in mind the tautological statement made above, one can then understand that people whose preconscious investments of interest do not or should not go in the direction of capitalism can maintain an unconscious libidinal investment consonant with capitalism, or that scarcely threatens it. In the first case, they confine and localize their preconscious interest in wage increases and the improvement of the standard of living. Powerful organizations represent them, which get nasty as soon as the nature of their aims is questioned. Quote, "It's clear that you're not workers. You have no idea whatsoever of real struggles. Let's attack profits for a better management of the system. Vote for a clean Paris. Welcome, Mr. Brezhnev." That's my old-timey radio voice. And how, indeed, could one fail to find one's interest in the whole, where one has sunk it, at the heart of the capitalist system? Or else, in the second case, there is truly a new investment of interest, new aims that presuppose another body than that of capital money. Those exploited become conscious of their preconscious interest, and this interest is truly revolutionary, a major break from the standpoint of the preconscious. First, what is the tautological statement from above? Because the previous paragraph and a few paragraphs are like 92 million nightmarish pages. What is the tautological statement? If one keeps in mind the tautological statement made above, is it that capitalists have the interest in capitalism?
I gotta reread the paragraph, I'm sorry.
That's okay, take a second. There's a few things that are totally tautological. The one that seems the most clearly tautological to me is capitalists first have an interest in capitalism, because that seems almost absurdly tautological. It's a commonplace statement they say, and they go on in that paragraph to say, capitalists have an interest in capitalism only through the tapping of profits that they extract from it, but no matter how large the extraction of profits, it does not define capitalism. They kind of explain it, but it's capitalists first have an interest in capitalism, I think. And then this paragraph is about taking that statement, capitalists first have an interest in capitalism. One can understand that people whose preconscious investments of interest do not or should not go in the direction of capitalism can maintain an unconscious libidinal investment consonant with capitalism, or that scarcely threatens it. People, like I think everyone on the server, I don't think anyone here is necessarily a capitalist, but we and our family, our families, our friends, people who are not necessarily capitalists, even if they may fancy themselves that, they actually maintain unconscious libidinal investments consonant with capitalism, in concert. We're in line with it. We do not threaten it, because that's the way of the system. In the first case, they confine and localize this preconscious interest in wage increases and the improvement of standard of living. Workers bitch about, we want to be paid more, I want life to be better, and if life is better, they're quite happy. and powerful organizations represent them, which get nasty as soon as the nature of their aims is questioned. I mean, if you've ever dealt with unions on being on the inside or even watched them on the outside, you do not question aims of any of these organizations or any of these nonprofits.
To your point, if you were to suggest to someone who's fighting, say, for higher wages, that they're actually, they're actually supporting capitalism, they would they would go crazy, right?
I think it's also about, how you take those goals and stuff, because I'm thinking about my own history in the union movements, and like there's the very, you have to take like SCIU, that's a big one in the US. Started out as a janitorial union. They like were organizing people that nobody wanted to organize in the 80s, and they were super militant and super like down. And they did good stuff in their later years and stuff, but if you go to Chicago now, they have like multi-story, like gigantic buildings. I remember during the Obama years, they had a giant portrait of Obama right there in the front hall. And I think no organization is like homogenous, so the stuff that happens on the ground, like these people, the rank and file were very involved in lots of really radical stuff, but it does become this question of sort of the larger goals, like as it becomes more institutionalized, it feels like an obvious point in the sense, like the managers of the union are more.
And there it is.
So the party just boycotted him. We've cut his voice because he's going and criticizing the Great Party.
Let's be clear, he's not workers. He has no idea whatsoever of real struggles.
SCIU shut me down.
No, it was me.
Oh, it was all of us.
That was the point.
It's the party, yeah.
But it's an interesting thing. And then the second half of that is where they go. In the second case, there is truly a new investment of interest, new aims that presuppose another body than capital money. It's basically that capitalists have an interest in capitalism. So fuck them, toss them aside. Everyone else either really falls into a place where their preconscious, unconscious interests are in line with capitalism, or they go in another direction where their investment is into something else. Again, this whole thing's a bit tautological and a little simplistic, but I think that's what they're trying to say.
Yeah, and so we've seen them come back to this point throughout this work, right? That you can be unconscious, that what's happening can be consciously revolutionary and unconsciously reactionary, right? That is to say that if you focus on the preconscious investment like they're talking about here, right? So like arguing for higher wages, arguing for a more efficient market, what we saw earlier with the New Deal and that, that does have preconscious effects, there's no doubt. But in terms of what's being invested unconsciously, what's happening in terms of that production, there is a reactionary investment being had.
And I do want to agree with Alyosha. The "Welcome, Mr. Brezhnev" line is pretty fucking great. One of my favorite podcasts, War Nerd, is doing a multi-part series on Boris Yeltsin's coup, and it's phenomenally interesting, worth checking out. Just to put out a recommendation about that time frame and how things were going around and the switch of the Soviet Union. But it is not enough for the libido to invest a new social body corresponding to these new aims in order for it to perform a revolutionary break at the unconscious level with the same mode as the preconscious break. In fact, the two levels do not function in the same mode. The new socius, invested by the libido as a full body, can very well function as an autonomous territoriality, but one that is caught and wedged in the capitalist machine and is localizable in the field of its market. For the great flow of mutant capital repels its limits, adds new axioms, and maintains desire within the mobile framework of its expanded limits. There can be a preconscious revolutionary break, no real libidinal and unconscious revolutionary break. Or rather, the order of things is as follows. There is first a real libidinal revolutionary break, which then shifts into the position of a simple revolutionary break with regard to aims and interests, and finally reforms a merely specific reterritoriality, a specific body on the full body of capital. Subjugated groups are continually deriving from revolutionary subject groups, One more axiom. This is no more complicated than in the case of abstract painting. Everything begins with Marx, continues on with Lenin, and ends with the refrain, "Welcome, Mr. Brezhnev." Is this still a case of revolutionaries speaking to another revolutionary, or rather a village clamoring for a new prefect? And if one were to ask, when it all started to go bad, how far back must we go for an answer? Back to Lenin? Back to Marx? So true is it that the various investments, even when opposed, can coexist with one another in complexes that are not the province of Oedipus, but that do concern the socio-historical field, its preconscious and unconscious conflicts and contradictions, about which it can only be said that they fall back on Oedipus, Marx the father, Lenin the father, Brezhnev the father. Fewer and fewer people believe in all this, but it makes no difference, since capitalism is like the Christian religion. It lives precisely from a lack of belief. It does not need it, a motley painting of all that has been believed. I'm having a hard time grasping this paragraph. I read through this last night, and I had the same issue. I was hoping it would be able to be cleared up if I read it aloud. Sometimes that happens for me here.
So, like, okay, if you put this into on a timeline, the past, the present, the future, the new solstice is something that would be out of this revolutionary break at the unconscious level. But because it is embedded in time, but into the spatial aspect that is real and tangible, it cannot really move away. There's always a break, but the fold actually refolds the revolutionary break back onto the tradition. So there's always, the Erstat is always there. The capitalist machine is always there. So if we break, this is the conversation we had about politics just before. If we are making a break outside of the market, but because we are from the market, we will refold back into the market. And this is a really problematic moment in history where, the unconscious has become so much embedded into capitalism because it is a product of capitalism through the market of desires, that any alternative, any break we will do will refold into capitalism. And what they're saying about this, how the subjugated groups are continually deriving from revolutionary subject groups. So basically, you have this multitude of people, if we take back the term of Art and Negri, and then you're going to get a subject group that is going to try and break out from the current state of affairs. But because it will state its claim, and the Erstat or the state will respond in return, and the market will respond, the subjugated groups will emerge again from this renewal of the market. So we're always into like a continuous, like eternal return when it comes down to this.
But I think you could just read this section as them just hammering home that point of like the stuff we spoke about yesterday. The point of the libido is that it invests the entire social field. So they say these are not the province of Oedipus, but concern the social historical field, its preconscious and unconscious conflicts and contradictions. Like they're trying to come up with a way of talking about why do people, do these things that seemingly go against their interests, that doesn't boil down to base psychologism or boil down to some kind of like they think the state is their daddy. Like there's ways that manifests itself in representation, but that isn't the reason necessarily. That's almost an effect of this originary, libidinal revolutionary break, which I think applies both to something like the Bolshevik Revolution as well as capitalism itself being a way of constantly creating these breaks. But then, yeah, I agree with Roger that you keep creating subjugated groups out of it, even though it appears to be. So like, tankies, like we're talking about in the chat, they get really attached to that image of the original revolutionary break, and they're not able to kind of see how subjugated groups can still derive out of that, in the sense of not being, in Deleuze and Guattari's language, not being subject groups anymore and being participating in all these flawed things.
Yeah, and this is big to say this into the 70s, where everybody everybody around Deleuze at the time had their Communist Party card, but he was the only one not having it. And to go that way into a full, left-wing Nietzschean perspective about like whatever we do, we'll butt fuck ourselves. um, it's big at the time, and like it was probably clashing a lot with the more traditional Marxist, or the red revolutionary groups.
Yeah, to put it very bluntly, one of the main points they're getting at is we always think the subjugated group isn't us, right? So like it's like the Sinclair Lewis line, it can't happen here. We always think Nazis are other than us. We always think the state is other than us. We always, we don't want to understand ourselves as subjugated, except in this preconscious way where the subjugation becomes a means of power. And then the subjugation is truly consummated, isn't it? But to that point, right, like this is a really heavy critique of not only of Marxism in that sense, but even how we do our own groups. Is ultimately that's what I think they're getting at, is like, with this whole idea of going back to Marx the father, Lenin the father. I mean, if you talk with a socialist today and Marxists, this is still what they do, is like everything's got to go back to that time when they had it right and we just misinterpreted them.
Yeah, that line, let's go back and find out where it went wrong. It's a really interesting one.
This is interesting because when it comes down into religion, because they say capitalism is a religion, but Marxism and revolutionary thinking could be also an eschatological or teleological form of religious thinking, in the sense that, if we act according to what God asked us to do, we would go back to Evan or Eden or whatever it is. But it's the same thing in the revolutionary promise. If we would do exactly what Marx or Feuerbach before him told us to do, we would have the complete revolution. It's like there's like a mode of instruction that is being there, and people, it's like political alchemy. It's saying that if we do stuff in order, we will reach a goal. So into this political, and I think that's the difference, because I've been struggling with the political aspect of Deleuze and Guattari, and because I'm older and because I've been into left-wing stuff, I still have this ontology of direction, in the sense that the revolution must have a goal. And I think that the way they're doing it, they're just saying, okay, let's get rid of intent and let's get rid of goals and let's see how the process can lead us somewhere else. And it's really difficult for people in my generation to wrap our mind around this. Maybe it makes sense more for younger people, but it's a thing. And again, that's another break from traditional Marxism.
So to try to say it again, I'm going to try to reword it to make sure I understand this. They're talking about the nature of revolutionary thought is it starts from a position of true unconscious revolutionary break, where there isn't necessarily even a goal. It's just things get to a point where we've got to shatter. It's just done. And then at some point, the revolution ends up having some semblance of a goal. And that goal, almost on the paranoiac side of things versus the schizo, that goal has shape. And that shape and that structure is the thing that people start aiming for. Rather than just change, rather than just shifting things, we're aiming now for that structure of society or that setup. Over time, that structure gets harder, more ensconced, more into it, more built in. And as things sort of begin to fall apart, because that's sort of the nature of things, the more we get closer to these structures that don't actually exist and the more we need them to function, the more their flaws are exposed. Capitalism being a good example of that. The thing they're pushing, they're talking about is that that's essentially what has happened, and then people are so invested in the idea of the revolution or what the original goal was that they're unable to even start talking about real revolution again because they're already invested in this sort of molar concept of revolution.
Mm-hmm. See, when I say religion, okay, like it's take the example of people who are going to mass, like Christian people are going to mass like every Sunday. They go there, and they feel that, they're meeting God again, and there's the whole discourse, the ritual, some form of praxis. But at the same time, they believe that they are the chosen one or whatever else and doing good unto the world. But what happens between Sundays, and that's a real question. So this religious aspect of a political program and political belief, it's like an act of faith, saying if we do this, it will give us this kind of after world. The post-revolution world will be this because we're acting a certain way right now. It's the same thing as religious people. They say, oh, if I go and do my take the I don't know how to call this in English, but when you eat the bread, the body of Christ, it's like the redemption. What if I'm doing these redemption acts? It will lead me to paradise. But at the same time, what leads you to paradise is what you do between Sundays, not what you do on Sundays. And that's the same for revolutionary thinking. It's not because you can recite part of the the Communist Manifesto that you are a revolutionary. Revolutionary is changing how desire is going through you and how you're changing your daily and every act that you do in your life. This is the real revolutionary moment, and how this leads to a crystallization into the collective. But just the thoughts and prayers won't cause a revolution.
So I keep going back to this book that's sadly not translated into English, beziehungsweise Revolution by Bini Adamczak, who also wrote this Communism for Kids book that maybe you've heard of, because that's translated.
It's the best. It's the best thing ever. You should buy it. If you are ever going to have children, you should have it ready for them. It's an amazing book.
And even if you don't have kids, like, it's really not only a kid's book. And if you're scared of easy text, there's also like an amazing afterword in it. But to go back to her larger book from 2017, and it's been a while since I've read it, so I can't give a detailed account of it, but she analyzes the revolution of 1917, the Russian Revolution, and contrasts it with like the whole historical moment of 1968. And she does that with a kind of Deleuzian framework. Like, it's not purely, but there's a lot of Deleuze in there. And the start of her analysis is basically that she looks at a scene that happened after the revolution, and in the 1920s in Moscow, where there is like this post-revolutionary nostalgia for the revolution. And the question is basically, what happens? Why do the people that are now in this post-revolutionary society feel nostalgia for the revolution? And which it comes back to is like a really detailed analysis of like generations of the revolution and how things shifted and how the revolution eventually failed and all that stuff. But the main bit about it is that the revolution was really a moment where solidarity was like a tangible thing and not an empty concept. It was a practice. There were practices of solidarity, and there was a real moment where structures could change, and it all went to shit afterwards. But the point is that she tries to extract an idea of how this kind of structure of this kind of moment could be spoken of and maybe utilized for future political projects. It's a really great book. I cannot recommend it enough. It's sadly not translated into English.
We'll find a way to do it. But I want to add in, because I really like the thing in this paragraph where they talk about sort of the change over time and how the revolutionary becomes almost reactionary. Because one of the things when I was, when all of us growing up, well, what happened to the Soviet Union? What happened to Che? What happened to Mao? These revolutionaries who started from a place of, I mean, most of them, all of them, as far as I can tell, feel free to tell me otherwise, came at these things very much from a revolutionary curiosity perspective. Their writings were extraordinary. I still think a lot of Stalin's writings are even interesting, and I'm not a fucking tanky at all. But at some point, they all, we like to say, or I like to used to say, that they lost their way. But I don't think that's necessarily right. They almost had their way so strictly in front of them because they were so deeply invested in the concept that they had.
We never lose our ways. We
Can
never
I,
do that.
No.
It's only the ways we are doing. We never lost.
No,
it.
that's exactly my point. That's exactly my point, is that the way almost becomes so deeply crystallized for them that they're unable to see anything else but that goal.
Well, one thing I want to offer something here is that I don't think we're all necessarily doing this, but I think one risk of this line of argument that we're making is that, and we talked about it yesterday, is that you can kind of end up in what I think accidentally looks like, and I'm not saying it is, but it starts to look like the worst fears people have about like postmodernist relativism. And what I think we should think about, for me in particular, is like, I don't think we shouldn't just take a heuristic and generalize it like, if a revolution has a goal, that means it's inherently reactionary. It's not really that, because I think it would be very rich to tell people in like, the 1811 slave uprisings in Louisiana that, oh, you have a goal? That means that your revolution isn't real. Like it's not what this is about. I think the point is to think about there are different kinds of goals, and there are goals that are sort of like policy decisions and sort of a very specific, despotic signifier type attempts to move in a particular direction. And then there's kinds of goals that are about establishing a new plane of possibilities or new plane of imminence. And I think it actually speaks in our contemporary times. You think about Black Lives Matter. I think one of the hilarious things that I always think is, besides the fact that there's plenty of actual concrete proposals that scare reactionaries and conservatives, the thing that I always hear in every social movement, whenever it happens in the United States context, at least, is there's always this thing of like, well, what do they even want? Like, what are they asking for? It's just a bunch of anarchy. Like, they don't really want anything. And there's a part of me that has to chuckle because I'm like, well, besides the fact that I think there are actual worthwhile goals that aren't just like reactionary, re-territorializing things, even if there weren't, this is kind of the point. I'm like, the point is it shouldn't stop, and I think if you are part of a movement or a group or you're trying to change something and it's like, all right, we need to defeat the Tsar. Like, of course, the Tsar is fucking oppressing everyone. But if you think that by defeating the Tsar, you have now, like Roger said, you've arrived in the promised land, you've kind of already set yourself up, even from the beginning, for a kind of failure. You need to be able to see these as just moments and moments of opening up possibility. And if you don't keep that going, like Guattari is coming from this Trotskyist tradition where they're very obsessed with the idea of permanent revolution. And I think not wrongly, in the sense that so we shouldn't get into a point of like, and I don't think anyone here is doing this, but of that kind of like intellectual post-leftism where you essentially refuse to participate in anything because you say it's all compromised. I don't really think that's what this is about. It's more about saying, that your horizon matters.
You're completely right. A very, very short, simple version of that from my life, at least as I'm understanding this. I grew up in Denver, and all I dreamed was of being able to sort of move to a bigger city, and San Francisco was that because it was a tech hub, freedom, all kinds of stuff, whatever it was. And two things I eventually moved there, got a good job, really had a great time. Then at some point I had almost achieved that goal. The question would be whether or not I started to understand that goal was what defined it. And if I stayed there trying to, because it ended up not being what I thought, because San Francisco is kind of a nightmarish neoliberal hellscape. I assumed it was this really left-wing thing. But instead, I ended up sort of changing around what my expectations were and what my goals were. But I could have just stayed there and tried to fight for it and tried to put myself in a position where I really believed in San Francisco, which would have been just decimating to me morally. It feels like that kind of goal and achievement of it. I'm not trying to shit on anyone who has a goal. The Haitian uprising had the goal of freedom, and it ended up turning into what it turned into. It's not about having a goal directly. It's about how we regard that goal and how we sort of deal with that as a thing that continues on. Again, it's the Zizek line. So you've had your revolution, now what?
Okay, so now let me just say something, because I think the issue is less to talk about does this have a goal or doesn't it have a goal. I think we should rather talk about what role does gold speak. What role do goals play in how we speak about revolution and how we practice, like in our political practice, because this talk of a revolution having a goal supposes a very specific kind of political subject, revolutionary subject. And I think that's a bit kind of what they are getting at here, that this presupposition of a unified revolutionary subject is actively hindering like a really creative, like in the sense of producing new social things, revolution, because you're so focused on capturing all these lines of flights again. You're kind of focusing on capturing the revolution again. You're not letting it flow in that sense. And I think that's helpful to look at goals in the same way that we know from Bergson to look at possibilities. Goals exist in retrospect. We can identify what the direction of revolution was when we analyze it from after the fact. But looking at it in the sense that there's this unified revolutionary subject that that aims at this goal in the process is actively squashing all revolutionary potential. That's also something that in the Adamczyk book is really emphasized. She develops this notion of a synaptic construction of the revolution, which basically goes to the point that it's not about this vanguard party, about this unified revolutionary subject. It's very much about the proliferation of desire in ways that breaks the structures, and not in capturing this movement. And I think in a very theory practical sense, I like to say that if your political theory supposes that a better society is only possible if everyone has understood your theory, then it's probably a bad theory for political practice. And I think that gets at kind of the same point.
I'm just going to say, Lou, I'm always eternally impressed with anyone who speaks their second language better than I do my first. So, really great. Thank you for that very much. I'm going to continue on to the next paragraph because I think this will be, we're going to have a series of review sessions, I have a feeling, for this entire section. But the reverse is also true. Capitalism is constantly escaping on all sides. Its productions, its arts, and its science form decoded and deterritorialized flows that do not merely submit to the corresponding axiomatic, but cause some of their currents to pass through the mesh of the axiomatic, underneath the recordings and reterritorializations. Subject groups, in their turn, derive from subjugated groups by way of ruptures in the latter. Capitalism is continually cutting off the circulation of flows, breaking them and deferring the break, but these same flows are continually overflowing and intersecting one another according to schizzes that turn against capitalism and slash into it. Capitalism, which is always ready to expand its interior limits, remains threatened by an exterior limit that stands a greater chance of coming to it and cleaving it from within, in proportion as the interior limits expand. That is why the lines of escape are singularly creative and positive. They constitute an investment of the social field that is no less complete, no less total than the contrary investment. The paranoiac and the schizoid investments are like two opposite poles of unconscious libidinal investment, one of which subordinates desiring production to the formation of sovereignty and to the gregarious aggregate that results from it, while the other brings about the inverse subordination, overthrows established power, and subjects the gregarious aggregate to the molecular multiplicities of the productions of desire. And if it is true that delirium is coextensive with the social field, and these two poles are found to coexist in every case of delirium, and fragments of schizoid revolutionary investment are found to coincide with the blocks of paranoiac reactionary investment, the oscillation between the two poles is a constituent aspect of the delirium.
So, in a very simple sense, this is important to understand, right? Capitalism conditions both subjugated and subject groups. It's not as though these things can take place outside of relationship to
And now we have this refolding of how subject group are rupturing from subjected groups, and how we had the reverse before, and now we have them in the order.
Well, they're always in the order, right? The subject group and the subjugated group, despite the oscillation between the two, are both conditioned by the socius of capital.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's it's the second part of the first process.
Okay, walk me through that.
Oh, because in the part before we said that subject groups wait what are
that subject groups can become subjugated groups, right?
Yes, and now the subject groups are rupturing from subjected groups. Sorry, I'm having a hard time like with the English and French because I'm into the French version. But it's like one produced the other, and the other will produce the first.
Right. And so in this sense, this is kind of the two hands of capitalism as they talk about, right? On the one hand, capitalism does the schizophrenic, right? It does do deterritorializing and decoding. And this is important because on the other hand, the stat is there, right? And so overcoding occurs as well. So there's a series of recodings happening here, both that can produce subject groups, can produce subjugated groups, and nonetheless allow for an oscillation of investments. That is, capitalism itself allows for subject groups and subjugated groups to not only be produced, but to oscillate between each other.
Mm-hmm. And when we're saying like there's the flows and breaking the flows, it's the same metaphor that we were using about the pipes. The pipes are producing certain types of groups, but it also like puts like it saturates desire, because it creates borders, and those borders are being forced upon, and because it's the only those borders can explode, and that the flow back into it. So it's always this weird dialectic. I don't like to use dialectic when we talk about Deleuze and Guattari, but it makes sense to me. This weird dialectic between being a subject and subjugated. It's always this weird, like the revolutionary can only be the one that is oppressed, but the revolutionary will be oppressed. It's always this kind of weird movement between one pole to the other. And when we talk about pole, it's going to be the paranoid pole versus the schizoid one.
But what's good about what Deleuze and Guattari do is that they, unlike other thinkers, they're not trapped. There might be a kind of dialectic that's happening, but the important part of this paragraph that I can see is when they're saying capitalism, ready to expand its interior limits, remains threatened by an exterior limit that stands a greater chance of coming to it and cleaving it from within. That is why the lines of escape are singularly creative and positive. they talk, and just above that, they talk about the same flows are continually overflowing. There's a sense in which like it's like the oozing triangle. There's no actual, even though it's oscillating between the two poles, it's not as though that is all that there is. It's not eternally trapped in this, historical unfolding that's only ever going to be one pole or the other. There's this potential outside that isn't always realized, but is still there as a potential. And I think that is kind of why to me, that their stuff is so interesting, because it doesn't. You read a lot of other theorists, and it kind of, no matter how lucid they are, it's almost like the Ursula K. Le Guin thing, where she said it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. Like it's like as though they cannot even conceive that there could be something outside of it, and it kind of re-territorializes itself into almost like a religious ideology. So.
Mm-hmm. And I would ask a question. Maybe they talk about it later, because I'm trying to wonder, like in '72, what was the exterior limit of capital at the time? Because now we have the Anthropocene, we have the ecological crisis, we have massive restructuration. But like, what was the exterior limit to capitalism at the time? The communist regime, or?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because like this is written after like the whole thing of May '68, right? Where they run up to '68 with Pt6 in Hungary and like 68 in Prague, were major points where a lot of Western communists turned their back to the USSR, when before there was still a lot of idealism when looking at like Moscow and the real existing communism, if you want so.
I mean, and don't forget, in the U.S., that 1968 was the famous Democratic National Convention, where they basically completely fucking just threw out the will of the people and the revolutionary spirit. So it's a big deal. It was a big deal here. It was the change sort of to this weird new neoliberal order. '68 was just this global nightmare of everything sort of being subsumed by sort of neoliberal capitalist movement. It's crazy. Everything falling apart.
It's a fun story. China declared in '67 that the Soviet Union now is capitalist and the Soviet Revolution is failed. Didn't have much to do with Russia, probably, but it was the year in which China engaged in foreign trade with the US for the first time.
I want to make sure, though, when we're talking, just to make a point of clarification, like, and this goes hand in hand with your criticism, like, we tend to discuss revolutions and that as events upon which everything is both simultaneously leading up to, inevitably, and that will change everything that comes after, right? It's almost apocalyptical in that way. But for like Deleuze and Guattari, they're not understanding revolutions in this grand sense any more than the reactionary would be in that grand sense. They're understanding in terms of processes in the same way that there is not a schizo person, right? There is a schizophrenic process through which desiring machines participate in the same way that the reactionary operates in that manner, as does the revolutionary.
Yeah, I'm going to move forward to the next paragraph. I think more about oscillation. It appears, however, that the oscillation is not equal, and that as a rule, the schizoid pole is potential in relation to the actual paranoiac pole. How can we count on art and science except as potentialities, since their actuality is easily controlled by the formations of sovereignty? This results from the fact that the two poles of unconscious libidinal investment do not maintain the same relationship, nor the same form of relationship with the preconscious investments of interest. On the one hand, in fact, the investment of interest fundamentally conceals the paranoiac investment of desire and reinforces it as much as it conceals it. It covers over the irrational character of the paranoiac investment under an existing order of interests, of causes and means, of aims and reasons. Or else the investment of interest itself gives rise to and creates those interests that rationalize the paranoiac investment. Or, yet again, an effectively revolutionary preconscious investment fully maintains a paranoiac investment at the level of the libido. to the extent that the new socius continues to subordinate the entire production of desire in the name of the higher interest of the revolution and the inevitable sequences of causality. In the other case, preconscious interest must, on the contrary, discover the necessity for a different sort of investment, and must perform a kind of rupture with causality as well as a calling in question of aims. This is why we should hold off on some of our deeper conversations, because it's like we start talking and we get about halfway through an idea that's basically talked about in the next paragraph. This does feel like Bergson, Lou. Yes, it does. Feels Bergson-esque for sure.
That's good though, because that means we follow, and we're following the line correctly because we're discussing what is coming after. But difference in French and English, this is like there's no paragraph breaks. This is like one big thing.
Well, I got to tell you, it makes me really glad I don't read French. I'm just saying. I don't know if I could handle this if it was one fucking long paragraph. Here's Anti-Oedipus. It's a single paragraph that's 922 pages. Oh God.
Yeah, but like it's interesting this kind of breakage within the text, because it creates two different impression of the ideas, because just of the format.
Well, it does, and it also gives us, I mean, to be completely and wholly self-interested, it's like they designed it for us to stop in between and have discussions that would lead us to the next paragraph.
Oof. Somebody was watching over us. Okay.
Yeah. The Delusian gods. I mean, it's so this section is literally talking about the development of the goals and how the libidinal efforts and the pushes between the two sides of the oscillating poles, the schizo and the paranoiac, how they operate differently, because they operate differently and not equal. The oscillating gods. I like that a lot. We're gonna go with oscillating gods. But it feels like that's what they're talking about here. On the one hand, the paranoiac, the investment of interest fundamentally conceals the paranoiac investment of desire and reinforces it as much as it conceals it. Covers over irrational character of it under an order of interest, causes and means, aims and reasons. The paranoiac investment actually has the things it's not aware of, the lack of the actual knowledge. Again, the paranoiac pole is about believing that the world is known, that you're able to define it clearly, but anything that doesn't fit that, you do this wonderful thing where it instantly becomes these blind spots. And that's what they're talking about, is these sort of blind spots that are created.
Kind of.
I have a weird question before we go. Are we still into, are we talking about capitalism as a whole, or the revolutionary aspect of it?
I think we're talking about just how things work.
Perfect.
I don't see this as being, so let me be clear. I don't see this as being related directly to capital, that this book and this paragraph at some point down post-capital, wherever the fuck we end up 100 years from now, they could read this and go, oh, yeah, this generally works. Boy, capitalism sounds like it sucked. And that's how I'm reading it. This is intended to be about just in general how people and the unconscious sort of investments are created, and how the two sides of the poles in the oscillation create those investments and develop them. Yeah. So someone was going to correct me though. Someone said almost.
I would correct you also. It's not capitalism that sucks. Ontologically, this is wrong. It's ontologically, it's capitalism produces suck.
I can give you that.
So capitalism also becomes the condition for that which doesn't suck, though.
I think one of the things they're saying in this paragraph is that I think they're kind of talking about the celibate machine, like the idea, like in Simondon, like once the individual is individuated, it veils the process of individuation, just like the celibate machine in Desiring Production. I think that what they're saying is the preconscious interest veils the the unconscious investment, which may be reactionary, underneath the apparent revolutionary interest.
That's good.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, because like, the paranoiac here, I don't think it's so much about knowing everything in that sense in the traditional paranoiac way. It's about the creation of exclusions, right? And in that sense, like a majoritarianism, or like they use the word gregariousness. So yeah, you're right. In terms of goals, laws, rules, how groups are formed in that manner, their point seems to very much be that this is created, just like you're saying, in veil of the of that which is not a rational process, right? The paranoiac happening doesn't necessarily have goals in that sense, but the goals are sort of transplanted upon it, like you're saying, preconsciously. So it is like a veil occurs. And in that sense, too, you actually, very interestingly, you have the production of goals here. But this is important, too, right? Because, like, one of the points they're getting at is, like, the whole idea of people saying, well, are you for the cause or against the cause? Yeah. You know, that very point about a kind of gregariousness in that manner, and I'm simplifying it quite a bit here to make the point. Deleuze and Guattari seem to be saying here, right? Well, what is this cause? Yeah, where they write, in the other case, the preconscious investment must, on the contrary, discover the necessity for a different sort of investment, and must perform a kind of rupture with causality, as well as a calling in question of aims and interests. So, in this sense, you're seeing aims and interests themselves actually called into question.
Mm-hmm. And this is, in simple terms, it's the revolution must not be like this grand scheme. It must be born of necessity. And I think that it's, from their empirical perspective, it's just that, that that the pole of the schizoid is just like, out of necessity you're doing something, you're producing something new, instead of having this pole of the rationalization of the revolution, for example, or placing goals. But it works also for the capitalist machine. But there's this into this whether it is capitalism as it functions, or capitalism as it reaches a breaking point where subjugated groups become subject groups. There's always those two poles of the paranoiac and the schizoid, and you can always go from one side to the other. So like, one type of revolution, for example, would be this kind of paranoiac way of doing it, and the other one would be a more productive, positive, vitalist side, if we want.
Well, you'll get, if you understand revolution in a larger sense, you're going to get an oscillation of both. And that's, I think, the kind of awareness they're giving us here, because like, creating a revolutionary group, how are you going to deal with subjugation, right? How are you going to deal with the investments of that which are occurring unconsciously? So a major point for them that I'm taking out of this is like, when we're talking about causes, goals, and aims, right? We shouldn't be blinded by them in terms of them taking them for granted as signs, which
Yeah,
I
but
know is Roger's
if
favorite part of Deleuze and Guattari, the semiotics.
yeah, have you ever been like into like college student groups or any kind of political groups? You can see that there's moment of movement, and there's moment of institution or institutionalization, where the group will put their grip over the flux, and will say, no, it needs to be that way, and they will try to correct things up. And so there's always this, I think, they're what they're talking about is real stuff that they've seen within the universities and within worker movements, and within May 68 they refer to real real delirium, the delirium of like pushing the boundary, but at the other side of like controlling what is being pushed, and who's pushing, and who's voicing stuff, and who has the right to talk, who should shut up, and who will decide or not. So there's always like this dictatorial perspective within micro politics and micro groups that is still there, and I think it's a form of criticism of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. To give two examples, since you brought up college, I encountered an atheist club and a Christian club. It was called Crew. And in both cases, what you find is there's this sense of where you can see a direct form of subjugation is where you can't be other than that. So this is a way in which two subjugated groups, and this is, I think, a more direct way of understanding the paranoiac in this sense. The becomings, differentiation, all of that, even the functionalities that are available, become immediately limited, right? Because this is working through a means of exclusion. So even when we say, oh yes, but anyone can go to crew, anyone can be there, right? We welcome the Islamic people. There is still a sense in which you're expected to become Christian during that time, yeah. And this is not a didactic argument against Christianity or crew. This is merely an observation about how this can actually function in any group. Because we could walk this out to a lot of different things beyond the religious. I'm just taking the easy example.
Well, it's the nature of pretty much anything that becomes a very difficult to define social aspect. I am reminded of the famous Supreme Court line, I don't know what pornography is, but I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. The reality is that most of these things that are difficult only exist through a process of exclusion. I can't positively identify what makes a Christian. That's not a thing that exists inside of most churches, but I can tell you who shouldn't be coming to church at our church on Sundays is far more common inside of groups, just by the nature of them.
Precisely. Authenticity in that manner is created in relation to signs.
But authenticity would still be a paranoiac investment into sub-molar group.
I can't wink on Mike, but wink.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, I am going to move to the next paragraph, however, so we can keep charging through. Any last notes before I do? All right. In each case, the problem is different. It is not enough to construct a new socius as full body. One must also pass to the other side of this social full body, where the molecular formations of desire that must master the new molar aggregate operate and are inscribed. Only by making this passage do we reach the revolutionary break and investment of the libido. This cannot be achieved except at the cost of, and by means of, a rupture with causality. Why did I say rapture? Desire is an exile. Desire is a desert that traverses the body without organs and makes us pass from one of its faces to the other. Never an individual exile, never a personal desert, but a collective exile and a collective desert. It is only too obvious that the destiny of the revolution is linked solely to the interest of the dominated and exploited masses. But it is the nature of this link that poses the real problem, as either a determined causal link or a different sort of connection. It is a question of knowing how a revolutionary potential is realized in its very relationship with the exploited masses or the weakest links given system. Do these masses or these links act in their own place within the order of causes and aims that promote a new socius? Or are they, on the contrary, the place and the agent of a sudden and unexpected eruption, an eruption of desire that breaks with causes and aims and overturns the socius, revealing its other side? In the subjugated groups, desire is still defined by an order of causes and aims, and itself weaves a whole system of macroscopic relations that determine the large aggregates under a formation of sovereignty. Subject groups, on the other hand, have as their sole cause a rupture with causality, a revolutionary line of escape. And even though one can and must assign the objective factors, such as the weakest links, within a causal series that made such a rupture possible, only what is of the order of desire and its eruption accounts for the reality this rupture assumes at a given moment in a given place.
That last sentence is cited as referring to, quote, on the analysis of subject groups and their relations with desire and with causality, see Jean-Paul Sartre, Critique of Dialectical Reason.
Yeah, Kant mentioned that earlier in chat, but I don't think he's listening now.
He found a line of escape.
I think he muted himself. We'll give it a second because I think unless anyone else is a major expert on which not. I know Kent has read it extensively, and I'm with Angus. I don't understand their point about causality ultimately side of this paragraph.
Okay, so I can try to do a thing with that. Like I'm not super deep in the text. I haven't read this before, and I'm just listening right now. Okay, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But yeah, Bergson incoming. So what I said earlier, right, with that desire or goals that only exist in retrospect. That's ultimately the Bergsonian point about the future not existing. The future needs to be produced, and the future not existing means that it doesn't exist as differentiated entities, which basically would be the point about intentions or goals, right? If you have intentions or goals, you basically imagine that there are like fully differentiated objects of thought that just need to be realized, but they don't ultimately change. You just add the predicate of existence to something that's already formed. And the Bergsonian point now is that this doesn't make sense at all, because in that conception, you basically accept the determinist framework. Everything exists, and time just passes through this already existing thing. And the point is to get to a conception of reality that in which time actually matters, in which time duration is actually referring to a change of the world, and in that, which basically necessitates that we come to some kind of break with causality, in the sense that so the Bergsonian break with causality is that he basically says, in real time, in duration, causality doesn't make sense because causality is predicated on the possibility of states of the world repeating, which can't happen because every moment contains all of the past. So the moment that is now is different from the moment that was just a second ago, at least by the fact that it contains the last moment. And this is linked to this evolving or durational view of reality, where future does not exist in the sense, because that's exactly the process, right? You have this virtual that differentiates into the past. The present is exactly not a static moment, but the process of differentiation of the virtual future, if you want to call it that, into the past. But by going through this process, only by going through this process, the future or these distinct entities are differentiated. This process of differentiation, that's exactly like later commentators have identified this with the notion of passive synthesis, which is ultimately taken from Husserl. I don't think Bergson himself speaks in these terms, but Deleuze is very clearly drawing Husserl and Bergson together in this idea of passive synthesis with the Bergsonian virtual. And yeah, the virtual has this kind of ambiguous status because it's at the same time like the mode of existence of the past, but also the material which differentiates into the future, or which differentiates into more past, which in Bergsonism, Deleuze speaks about qualitative multiplicities always splitting, always differentiating themselves, being divisible in that sense, in contrast to the quantitative multiplicities. I'm not sure how he does this all in difference and repetition because I haven't read it. But from what I know about it, what I've read from secondary literature and what I've seen in Anti-Oedipus, is very close to his reading of Bergson in that regard. I hope this kind of helps with anything. I've got a bit in rambling mode, I think.
No, I think that's really great. And does anyone have any quick response? Because I think it's worth us actually. The next couple of paragraphs dig a little bit more into this, but that was a phenomenal explanation.
I think we could argue about the usage of virtual and actual, but I think that works in a certain manner because in for example, if we take a city, like the present of a city, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not the actual, it's the virtual bits and the actual would be the abstract machine that is producing it. So there's always this weird shift, and I don't know if they changed the way that Bergson was applying those concepts, but I feel that there's like some sort of a reversals there. And for example, the future as the future is a moment of actualization of the abstract machine. It's not virtual in the sense that it's not something in reserve. It's something to be actualized. So I don't know. It's maybe like a difference of understanding there.
So I think just a short note on that. I've been saying that the virtual and actual are very Deleuzian concepts, not so much Bergsonian concepts, because Bergson doesn't really develop them systematically. Like he doesn't ever go and say like this is the actual and this is the virtual, and he's not even consistent about his usage of the virtual. He has points where he uses virtual basically interchangeably with possible, which at other points he vehemently disputes. And Deleuze, that's really what Deleuze does in Bergsonism. He kind of distills a notion of the virtual. And I'm going very much by the notion of virtual that is in Bergsonism here, not difference in repetition or 1,000 plateaus or anything. And yeah, I think to be actually useful, you need to clarify further. And I'm actually not sure about the actual and all this. Like, it's a working understanding that I'm operating under here, which is why I say, take everything I say with a grain of salt, even if I kind of seem knowledgeable now.
I'm going to make a note that during our review, we need to spend, and maybe we actually just should have a discussion at some point where we really go over the concept of virtual, actual, possible, potential, and really define out these terms, because I think it's a really worthwhile discussion, but it helps clarify a lot of things as well. So,
but to that point though, I think we need to go back into the text, because that is a very interesting discussion of time, actuality, virtuality, potentiality, and all these very other interesting terms from Bergsonian and Deleuzian conceptions of time. But I think the key here is where they write, in the subjugated groups, desire is still defined by an order of causes and aims, and itself weaves a whole system of macroscopic relations that determine the large aggregates under a formation of sovereignty. Subject groups, on the other hand, have as their sole cause a rupture with causality, a revolutionary line of escape. And even though one can and must assign the objective factors, such as the weakest links, within causal series that made such a rupture possible, only what is of the order of desire in its eruption accounts for the reality that this rupture assumes at a given moment in a given place. So the point here is, I think, in a very simple sense, subjugated groups, right, they are organized in terms of direct causality, where everything is supposed to be exclusionary. The becomings are all working together, or at least are taken to be working together under the veil of the rationality in that sense. But they're thought to be instrumentally working towards some larger purpose, some greater goal, or that they are all mutually causal. The subject group is a response to that in a sense, right? The subject group breaks from all that. So this is in a sense like, supposing you have an institution or a group crop up around this goal, like the Surrealists. When Artaud was kicked out of that, they give him as an example of a subject group, even though he's a person. Artaud's break from the Surrealists allows Artaud to both create and progress a whole series of projects. In many cases, that wouldn't have been possible had he been trying to be a surrealist.
It is clear how everything can coexist and intermix. In the Leninist break, for example, when the Bolshevik group, or at least a part of this group, becomes aware of the immediate possibility of a proletarian revolution that would not follow the anticipated causal order of the relations of forces, but that would singularly precipitate things by plunging into a breach, the escape or revolutionary defeatism. In reality, everything coexists. Still hesitant preconscious investments in the case of some people who do not believe in this possibility. Revolutionary preconscious investments in those who see the possibility of a new socialist but maintain it in an order of molar causality that already makes of the party a new form of sovereignty. And finally, unconscious revolutionary investments that perform a real rupture with causality in the order of desire. And in the same people, the most varied kinds of investments can coexist at such and such a moment. The two kinds of groups can interpenetrate. This is because the two groups are like determinism and freedom in Kant's philosophy. They indeed have the same object, and social production is never anything other than desiring production, and vice versa, but they don't share the same law or the same regime.
So to basically expound on my previous point, having a red card in that sense isn't actually revolutionary in that manner. It's not, right, it's functioning as a sign in that sense. More directly, one can be within a subjugated group as a sub and be kind of interpenetrated in this respect within a subject group. But the larger point here is that ascribement to a group in that sense is not going to guarantee the revolutionary line of escape. There is something revolutionary in this sense as an investment made by simply leaving, or allowing desires to leave the group in that sense.
Yeah, and I think we can take contemporary groups. You know, we're talking about the Bolshevik, but like I think like most people are young here, and it's something of the past. But we can take something like BLM or disabled people trying to get out of institution. It's the same kind of thing. It's we don't to go back previously to what we were reading before into the previous paragraph. The state of affair doesn't express a causality that will produce a revolutionary moment. It's one event. The concept of event will come later into delusion, whatever, but there's an event. There's something that happens. For example, somebody gets killed by the cop. And from there is a whole movement, a whole new collective intensity that rises up that actually pinpoints the ontological reality of a subjected group, and they create themselves as a subject group that is rupturing from the current state of affair to allow a new line of flight. So it's and then within that group there's going to be the more reformist, and there's going to be people who are asking for black liberation or disability liberation. So I think that we can easily take those elements and put this into contemporary movements.
Yeah, because majoritarianism begins to allow for the weaker links they're talking about here. The majoritarian in that sense is moving because it's understood through, right, the gregarious in that manner, aggregation. These things are changing, and in that manner, this is kind of how you start to get these potentials for revolutionary investments. Is these sort of minorianism, I don't want to use that word, these kind of minorities in that sense, that which is sort of in contrast to the majoritarian, that which is not part of the gregarious, but also is a condition for the gregarious. In that sense, you have a potential for becomings there that are actually being excluded. And this is something that groups do have to deal with.
Yeah, and when they say a still hesitant preconscious investment in the case of some people who do not believe in this possibility, you are into the US, and there's a discomfort. Everybody knows that racism is there, that there's differences, and there's inequalities until that moment. That becomes clear, and the abstract machine that actually is creating uh, the structure of racism is being named. And the moment it's being named, it opens to a whole world of possibilities of, smashing racism, smashing the white man, smashing the institution. And all of this becomes something that was hesitant before and uncomfortable to something that passes as a fact.
Mm-hmm. But then comes reterritorialization, right?
Yeah, because there's a possibility of, the molar is recognizing itself into this moment as well. So there's a movement, there's a translation. Everything starts to shift.
Well, and the other part of this, how I read this, what I got from it, and I like it, is the idea that it's we shouldn't be thinking of these events as singular. We shouldn't be thinking them as large monolithic groups. That in reality, as they say, everything coexists. There's all of these investments, not just in terms of different people having them. This person is interested in revolution. This person doesn't believe it's possible. But much more that all of the people themselves actually have their own preconscious investments across the board that are fitting all of these. These varied kinds of investments can coexist. The two kinds of groups can interpenetrate. It's because the two groups are like determinism and freedom. They indeed have the same object, but they don't share the same law or the same regime. I like the way of thinking about that. The removal of the monolithic largesse of singular groups, and instead thinking about it as, we're talking about hyper contingent events that are contingent on a major multiplicity, with lots of things, major, lots of shit that puts into it.
Yeah, and in that sense, right, being a part of any group, as though you can be a part of it till you just get tired of it or whatever, right? That's not the victory in and of itself. Or conversely, just because you've got these goals in that manner, in this sense, in the molar sense, right, as though it has this trajectory that is just, indelible, right? That's got no way of accounting for the flux that is actually producing all of these things and the contingencies that condition it.
And
what
with
this
that,
makes me think?
go
Sorry.
ahead. No, go for it. I'm about to move on to the next paragraph. You'll take the last note.
I'll just say it quickly. It's just a sort of a side thing. All of this discussion makes me think about a book that really changed my life when I was younger. Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson, I think his name is. And he, is a famous book where he's kind of arguing that like his basically nationalisms are all these, to be nationalist or to think that you're part of a nation is to be part of an imaginary community. And, this is how it works and historically. And he traces it through like the printing press and all these like revolutions in Latin America and all these things. And it's a very, very compelling book, and it was important for me. But it's interesting looking back. Like I still think there's stuff that you can get out of that. But what I think is useful about this framework is like, if you go with the imagined communities thing, like what Jack was saying of like, what does it mean to be part of a group? The way we conceive of it is you join a group, you're like, I am this now. And then what's really happening is that there's loads of fluxes and there's different ways that we are participating and being inflected by the preconscious interest and the unconscious, preconscious investments and unconscious interest, all those things. But we kind of flatten all, and sort of like it was said earlier, like it becomes this paranoid concealment of that, of the way in which participating in social spaces, in the social, is a continuous, like there's constant enunciation happening. And so you could look back at the imaginary community thing and be like, that's useful, but like nationalism doesn't just exist in people's minds, and they don't just all come together and agree, now we are this thing. Like it's a much more concrete and materialist process, I think, and that's kind of what they're getting at, in addition to the conscious and unconscious aspect.
To make just a quick note, and with that point, nationalism is always, it's not so much the nationalism in this larger sense, right? It's always about you're fitting into the group, right? Whether it's a sports team, whether it's a Discord server, whether it's, whatever the group is, it doesn't have to be, I'm an American.
All right. Now let's continue. The actualization of a revolutionary potentiality is explained less by the preconscious state of causality, in which it is nonetheless included, than by the efficacy of a libidinal break at a precise moment, schiz, whose sole cause is desire, which is to say the rupture with causality that forces a rewriting of history on a level with the real, and produces this strangely polyvocal moment when everything is possible. Of course, the schiz has been prepared by a subterranean labor of causes, aims, and interests working together. Of course, this order of causes runs the risk of closing and cementing the breach in the name of a new socius and its interests. Of course, one can always say that after the fact that history has never ceased being governed by the same laws of aggregates in large numbers. The fact remains that the schiz came into existence only by means of a desire without aim, or cause, that charted it and sided with it. Well, the schiz is possible without the order of causes. It becomes real only by means of something of another order. Desire, the desert desire, the revolutionary investment of desire. And that is indeed what undermines capitalism. Where will the revolution come from, and in what form within the exploited masses? It is like death. Where? When? It will be a decoded flow, a deterritorialized flow that runs too far and cuts too sharply, thereby escaping from the axiomatic of capitalism. Will it come in the person of a Castro, an Arab, a Black Panther, or a Chinaman on the horizon? I can't believe I'm on fucking text saying that word. A May 68, a homegrown Maoist planted like an anchorite on a factory smokestack. Always the addition of an axiom to seal off a breach that has been discovered. Fascist colonels, start reading Mao. They won't be fooled again. Castro has become impossible, even in relation to himself. Vacuoles are isolated, ghettos created, unions are appealed to for help. The most sinister forms of dissuasion are invented. The repression of interest is reinforced. But where will the new eruption of desire come from?
Real quick, the reference there is to Andrei Glucksmann has analyzed the nature of the special counter-revolutionary axiomatic in, I'll wait for Roger to correct me, Le Discours de la Guerre, Discourse of War, perhaps?
Yeah, Le Discours de la Guerre, war discourse. One specification, French English, referring to a Chinese person. In the French version, they were using N-words profusely, and this has been changed by the English translator. But in French, it's Chinese, and it morphed into something else, into English. So, we can see how certain type of racism is accepted into the English-speaking world, where another kind is not accepted. This is really interesting.
Well, and I think their point, if they use certain words, I tend to lean on, and of course they have probably some level of racist, imperialist. They're French at the time, but the provocative nature of use of these is kind of their point. That there's will it come in the person of a Castro, like of these people who are seen as, especially by, and I think maybe this may be an extreme statement, I don't know. There's a fetishization of minorities by the liberal white class, where they believe that, that's where revolution comes from. It comes from these poor minorities or these underclass people. And that fetishization, I think, is also part of what they're mocking a little bit here.
You know what just occurred to me in reading this section? I really like this little the sentence: "The fact remains that the schiz came into existence only by means of a desire, without aim or cause, that charted it and sided with it. While the schiz is possible without the order of causes, it is real only by means of something of another order: desire, the desert desire, the revolutionary investment desire." We've been kind of circling around this anyway, but I was just thinking back to our discussion, and Mohamed Bouaziz came to mind, who was the Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire. And that was kind of not the only event, but one of the major flashpoints of what ended up becoming the so-called, the Arab Spring and that. But I think it's such an interesting freeze, sort of, if you think about it, of that there was a power in that act of self-annihilation was it was like, I'm not advocating that kind of thing as a political platform. I'm just saying, if you look at it, that was this extreme, like, his being was being pulled taut by his inability to sell his fruit and his wares in the streets, and the frustration with the dictatorial regime and all these things. And what he ended up doing was this. It was an act of, it was like desiring machines being pushed into this like public space of like, okay, I'm just going to do this. I need to do this thing. I can't do anything else anymore. And it was such a stark thing that that it's not that caused this, or this is like the only cause or whatever. My point is just trying to think of how what happens in revolutionary moments isn't, the like democratic centralists want to think that you can kind of plan a revolution. And I think probably at best what you can do is you can ride the wave and try and, push it in different directions, which is, I think, what we saw with like Egypt, the way that was reterritorialized into like, Sisi now and stuff like that. My point is just what sparks it's like Lou said earlier, there's a way in which like something is put into the air, to make sound it cheesily. Like there's a new feeling in the air, and that sense of things ends up informing how people behave. But it's not in and of itself. Like Mohammed Bouaziz did not go into the street thinking, I'm going to take down the Ben Ami regime because they're corrupt dictators. He was like, I can't fucking take this anymore. I'm going to go do this thing. So I was just thinking about that.
Well, I read a little.
Just one thing. This is really interesting because my ex-girlfriend, we worked on this together. It was her thesis for her bachelor degree, and she was calling it the debt assemblage, in the sense that the Bouazizi situation, we could actually see how preconditions would arise that would give rise to revolutions. And she was trying to, like, from different perspective, the different situation, see where which element were coming into this assemblage that would, offer the precondition of an uprising. So that's really interesting that you're mentioning this right there, because I'm saying that it's been done before, and it really sucks. I don't have anything to do with my ex, but it really sucks that she didn't pursue that, because I think that was a really great idea, and you're just like stating it right now again.
I had a slightly different. I want to talk about this sort of second half of this paragraph where it talks and goes from that is indeed what undermines capitalism. Where will the revolution come from, and in what will form within the exploited masses? It is like death, where and when. They then go on to basically say it'll be a decoded flow, deterritorialized flow that runs too far and cuts too deep. And because of the nature of how capital reacts to breaks like that, it will be the body without organs will fall back on it as quickly as possible. And they give some great examples. Homegrown Maoists planted like an anchorite on a factory smokestack. The ability, there's always an axiom to seal off breaches that have been discovered, almost as if capital was aware, a monster of sorts. Fascist colonels reading Mao, so we're not fooled again. This is done. This is actually things that are done. Castro is impossible. That's not going to disagree there. Ghettos created for the Black Panthers. Unions are appealed to for help. The thing that runs and that goes through all of this is that the same breaks and flows that capital is able to completely reterritorialize is where revolution comes from. At least when we start thinking about, where will it come from, and demanding that sort of knowledge and thinking about it from that direction.
Yeah, and this is an important point for them too, because like, again, with like we should not confuse signs for something more than signs, right? This is kind of Magritte's point about the treachery of signs, yeah. But more to the point, with Maoism, with Mao, with what happened in Cuba and then the Bay of Pigs and that, we should not confuse things like the sign of Castro with something like a larger revolutionary investment that always has this, this essence of revolutionaryism to it. This is kind of what they're getting at, is like there's a kind of there's almost a kind of idolism and therefore idolatry that comes with how we deal with the revolutionary, especially in the preconscious sense, right? If we could just be like Castro was before he was Castro later on, you see, to that point too about like we talked a little bit about like their use of terms here and like especially the raciality. Part of what they're getting at as I read them, and part of the reason they're going to use terms that are considered derogatory, like for instance, the primitive, the savage, the barbarian, but also like those more charged words like Chinaman, or particularly the N-word in that sense, or some variant of it. What they're getting at here too is the way that this works in terms of production. These stereotypes are produced and very much in relation to the, I think, a kind of paranoiac investment. But they also present a form of becoming that is limited, and in that sense that can be biunivocalized. In a sense, to give you an example in a literary sense, this is like Sinclair Lewis. So I mentioned It Can't Happen Here earlier on, where, well, of course, we can't be the Nazis. We're in the good group. And those are conservatives anyways, right? But no, more to the point, in his novel King's Blood Royal, the main character is vehemently racist and participates in a racist collectivity until one day when he discovers that he has black ancestors. And he becomes ostracized because now the code and the signifiers have been turned upon him. But in that sense, too, you start to see the Deleuze and Guattari's point about not only how this functions within the subjugated group in that manner, but also how like what they're talking about in terms of like following a minority or looking for the weakest links, how there's a whole series of becomings and differentiation here that this actually does open up to us.
Those who have read us this far will perhaps find many reasons for reproaching us, for believing too much in the pure potentialities of art and even of science, for denying or minimizing the role of classes and class struggle, for militating in favor of an irrationalism of desire, for identifying the revolutionary with the schizo, falling into familiar, all too familiar traps. This would be a bad reading, and we don't know which is better, a bad reading or no reading at all. That's a dick way to put it. That's a dick way to put it. And in all probability, there are far more serious reproaches to be made, which we haven't even thought of. As for those we have named, we hold in the first place that art and science have a revolutionary potential, and nothing more. And that this potential appears all the more as one is less and less concerned with what art and science mean from the standpoint of a signifier or signifieds that are necessarily reserved for specialists, but that art and science cause increasingly decoded and deterritorialized flows to circulate in the socius, flows that are perceptible to everyone, which force the social axiomatic to grow ever more complicated, to become more saturated, to the point where the scientist and the artist may be determined to rejoin an objective revolutionary situation in reaction against authoritarian designs of a state that is incompetent and above all castrating by nature, where the state imposes a specifically artistic Oedipus, a specifically scientific Oedipus.
This is really interesting, and I feel that they're answering the criticism we were doing yesterday and earlier today. And so, yeah, they're conscious of the limits and conscious of how it could be taken by left-wing oriented people.
And kind of they're saying, again, it's a dickish way to put it, where it's like, look, it's a bad reading. They're talking about there's potentialities here. That they're not saying this is how revolution works. And I think they just described in the last few paragraphs why they're not doing that, because they don't want to give a goal or a structure to it. Instead, they're saying, look, these potentials exist. Here are where we're seeing them. Here's where we believe these potentials are at. And if you can sort of empower these people and look into that and play with these potentialities, we have a chance to actually really change stuff. And it ends with them. The lines here that really speak to me about especially our modern society. Art and science cause increasingly decoded and deterritorialized flows to circulate, flows that are perceptible to everyone, which force the social axiomatic to grow ever more complicated, to become more saturated to the point where the scientist and the artist may be determined to rejoin an objective revolutionary situation. The timing feels like we're speaking about now. Like this is very much what's happening inside of a lot of academic circles, as we have people in academia here that we're talking about, in artistic circles. It's really an incredible, meaningful moment, at least as I'm reading it.
Just want to say, and this will be very brief, if you're looking to see some examples of this kind of art, at least as I think it can be very much argued, I would recommend Adrian Piper's work.
To continue. Secondly, we have not at all minimized the importance of preconscious investments of class or interest, which are based in the infrastructure itself. But we attach all the more importance to them, as they are the index in the infrastructure of a libidinal investment of another nature, and that can coincide as well as clash with them. Which is merely a way to pose the question, how can the revolution be betrayed? Once it has been said that betrayals don't wait their turn, but are there from the very start, the maintenance of paranoiac unconscious investments in revolutionary groups. And if we put forward desire as a revolutionary agency, it is because we believe that capitalist society can endure many manifestations of interest, but not one manifestation of desire, which would be enough to make its fundamental structures explode, even at the kindergarten level. We believe in desire as in the irrational of every form of rationality, not because it is a lack, a thirst, or an aspiration, but because it is the production of desire. Desire that produces real desire, or the real in itself. Finally, we do not at all think the revolutionary is schizophrenic, or vice versa. On the contrary, we have consistently distinguished the schizophrenic as an entity from schizophrenia as a process. Now, the schizophrenic as entity can only be defined in relation to the arrests, the continuations in the void, or the finalist illusions that repression imposes on the process itself. This explains why we have only spoken of a schizoid pole in the libidinal investment of the social field, so as to avoid as much as possible the confusion of the schizophrenic process with the production of a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic process, the schizoid pole, is revolutionary in the very sense that the paranoiac method is reactionary and fascist. And it is not these psychiatric categories, freed of all familialism, that will allow us to understand the political economic determinations, but exactly the opposite.
You know, this little line should be served as people who are trying to find, salvation with their own psychological condition reading Deleuze and Guattari, because this happened quite a lot, and it's this confusion should be at the beginning of the book and at the beginning of every of their books.
I love this almost very direct call. We believe in desire as in the irrational of every form of rationality, and not because it is lack, because it is the production of desire, desire that produces the real in itself. Is such a clarion call to kind of their philosophy of things. Yeah, I don't know if I need. Does anyone have questions on this? Because I'm just going to move on because it's such a clear paragraph.
What if we don't want you to finish?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to finish. We've got like what, 2 pages, 3 pages left.
One half a page.
Yeah, not much. Guilfoyle has a great question. We're going to do it. We're going to answer a question. Produces the real on itself? Not on itself, in itself. And I think this is, and Ken's still here? Ken is still here. I think this is a response again to the Lacanian classic psychoanalytic play that lack is where desire comes from, that our lack of things is what drives us forward. They're saying, no, desire in and of itself, the production of desire, the desire that produces real desire, is the real in and of itself.
I think it's really about, like, they say this earlier, right? And they make clear that their real is not like the Lacanian real, but they actually talk about the naive reading of the Lacanian real, that it's actually reality, right? We are talking about the process of production of the world, right? And it's at the basis of their process ontology. We are talking about the real ontological level where this process happens. Where they have at the beginning of chapter 4 somewhere the sentence where they say that the desiring machines are matter. And I think we should take that serious, right? They are talking about reality here, not about some psychic thing.
They're talking about material reality. Because ultimately this is a schizoanalysis is about a material psychoanalysis, a materialist perspective. Am I wrong?
I think a material here introduced an unnecessary difference, because they basically get rid of every notion of a distinct psychic existence, which is what Ken and I were getting at a bit earlier in chat. If we introduce a notion of psyche here again, we need to be careful, because like traditional notions of the psyche don't really work, and I wouldn't want to slip too far into like panpsychism with what's going on here.
Fair enough. Let's Gilfoyle, please join us for our review of this. Let's make sure we go over this paragraph specifically. I'm going to continue to the next paragraph, however. And then above all, we are not looking for a way out when we say that schizoanalysis as such has strictly no political program to propose. If it did have one, it would be grotesque and disquieting at the same time. It does not take itself for a party or even a group. It does not claim to be speaking for the masses. No political program will be elaborated within the framework of schizoanalysis. Finally, schizoanalysis is something that does not claim to be speaking for anything or anyone, not even, in fact, especially not, for psychoanalysis. Nothing more than impressions. The impression that things aren't going well in psychoanalysis and that they haven't been since the start. We are still too competent. We would like to speak in the name of an absolute incompetence. Someone asked us if we had ever seen a schizophrenic. No, we have never seen one. If someone reading this book feels that things are fine in psychoanalysis, we're not speaking for him. And for him, we take back everything we have said. So what is the relationship between schizoanalysis and politics on the one hand, and between schizoanalysis and psychoanalysis on the other? Everything revolves around desiring machines and the production of desire. Schizoanalysis as such does not raise the problem of the nature of the socius to come out of the revolution. It does not claim to be identical with the revolution itself. Given a socius, schizoanalysis only asks what place it reserves for desiring production, what generative role desire enjoys therein, and what forms the conciliation between the regime of desiring production and the regime of social production is brought about, since in any case it is the same production, but under two different regimes. If, on this socius as a full body, there is thus the possibility from going from one side to the other, i.e. from the side where the molar aggregates of social production are organized, to this other side, no less collective, where the molecular multiplicities of desiring production are formed. Whether and to what extent such a socius can endure the reversal of power, such that desiring production subjugates social production and yet does not destroy it, since it is the same production working under the difference in regime. If there is, and how there comes to be, a formation of subject groups, etc.
This is the part where everyone looking for the political program throws their book against the wall.
Just buy a hammer instead.
Yeah, well, it's, I think, almost what they're saying in here. Let me try to say it in a different way. Oedipus is not a political program in and of itself. It is a process and a way of doing things within psychoanalysis that produces itself and moves on. It is a process that begets itself, self-replicating idea. Capital works the same way. Schizoanalysis is not a guide to a revolution or a map that takes you there. Instead, it's a process that teaches you how to find where desire is actually coming from and how to find where revolutionary enjoyment and jouissance may be experienced. That's how I read this.
Yeah. I think you're right. That's interesting because as I was doing my dissertation, I was asked the same question. They're like, "So what you're proposing? You know, where's the mode of instruction?" And I'm like, using delusion thought, I can offer a different view of reality. How could things be otherwise? But it's for the people to actually take this mode of analysis and analyze their own existences and like build from this. So like, like I'm just like pointing to things that are wrong, things that are, and I think that that's how do you say this? That's a good way to actually put it at the end of the book, saying, this is not a new book of the New Testament. It's not something that gives you the way to paradise. It just tells you to like map your way, cartography it, and maybe find a way out.
Well, I mean, they almost said 3 paragraphs ago that they almost said, hey, we can't give you a guide. If we said, here are the 17 steps to revolution, Capital would go, oh shit, and find a way to reterritorialize it.
And produce a Peterson with 24 rules.
Even if Capital didn't do that, this is sort of like, I think, the critique of like, democratic centralism, so-called. Like, you can have a whole, very detailed writings from Lenin in all the years leading up to the revolution in 1917, the first revolution, and then the 2 in 17 and all that. And, even though it's interacting with capitalism, of course, but even if there wasn't that kind of like pressure, even within itself, it very quickly, it wasn't like people like to think that, it was like when Stalin came around and things kind of got messed up. Like, go read about like war communism, go read about the NEP and all these things. Like, even my arch nemesis Zizek, funnily enough, is right when he does his introduction to one of Lenin's books, where he's like, and Trotsky as well, where he's like, this idea that like these possibilities for this, what we would call reterritorialization, weren't there already in the idea of these programs, which were, they leaned heavily on the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat to kind of justify, ends justifying the means and stuff, is facile. It was always there. And to like kind of place it at a later date is to excuse all the excesses and the suppressions of the SRs and the Kronstadt and all the rest of it under the name of like, this pure thing that was sort of like dissolved or something.
Yeah, it's they're saying it's communism failing as it did in Russia is not a bug, it's a feature, I think would be how I'd put it. That this is how the code was built. You just didn't notice it. Couldn't tell that they had all these prior investments at a basic desiring machine level that actually made sure that this is how this was going to turn out. It wasn't one person shows up and cleaves the world. It's the underlying code is written in this way to produce shit. I'm going to continue to the next paragraph. We're going to finish this. I'm not going to leave 2 paragraphs for fucking next week. So we're going to finish this out and have a lovely discussion. End this year. That would be amazing. If someone retorts that we are claiming the famous rights to laziness, to non-productivity, to dream and fantasy production, once again, we are quite pleased, since we haven't stopped saying the opposite, and that desiring production produces the real, and that desire has little to do with fantasy and dream. As opposed to Reich, schizoanalysis makes no distinction in nature between political economy and libidinal economy. Schizoanalysis merely asks, what are the machinic, social, and technical indices on a socius that open 2 desiring machines, that enter into the parts, wheels, and motors of these machines, as much as they cause them to enter into their own parts, wheels, and motors? Everyone knows that a schizo is a machine. All schizos say this, not just little Joey. The question to be asked is whether schizophrenics are the living machines of a dead labor, which are then contrasted to the dead machines of living labor as organized in capitalism. Or whether instead desiring technical and social machines join together in a process of schizophrenic production that thereafter has no more schizophrenics to produce. In her letter of ministries.
Lettre au ministre.
Letter of ministries? Is that
yes. Letter to ministries. Ministries are like the politicians here, like the head of
the ministers.
Yes.
Maud Manoni writes, one of these adolescents, declared unfit for studies, does... Oh, hi, Dexter. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry, guys. Sorry, my son's coming in, bringing me a cup of ice.
Are you going to share that cup of ice?
I will.
You better.
Let's see. Everyone knows that a schizo is a machine. All schizos say this, and not just little Joey. The question to be asked is whether schizophrenics are the living machines of a dead labor, which are then contrasted to the dead machines of living labor as organized in capitalism, or whether instead desiring technical and social machines join together in a process of schizophrenic production that thereafter has no more schizophrenics to produce. In her Letter to Ministers, Maud Manoni writes, "One of these adolescents, declared unfit for studies, does admirably well in a third-level class, provided he works some in mechanics. He has a passion for mechanics. The man in the garage has been his best therapist. If we take mechanics away from him, he will become schizophrenic again." Her intention is not to praise ergotherapy or the virtues of social adaptation. She marks the point where the social machine, the technical machine, and the desiring machine join closely together and bring their regimes into communication. She asks if our society can handle that, and what it is worth if it can't. And this is indeed the direction the social, technical, scientific, and artistic machines take when they are revolutionary. They form desiring machines for which they are already the index in their own regime, at the same time that the desiring machines form them in the regime that is theirs and as a position of desire. A fucking great paragraph. Again, this should just be at the beginning of the book, and then they should be explaining everything afterwards. It's such a clear, crisp. The Maud Manoni line here, talking about the schizophrenic who had tons of trouble in school, tons of issues, began doing work. He had passion for actually doing physical labor, building things, putting together puzzles of machines. Man in his garage has been his best therapist. We take that away from him. This process that he's producing, this building, he will become schizophrenic. I love that turn of phrase as they're trying to connect it with the desiring machine.
That, and there's a very nicely placed social criticism here, right? Because then the question would be, well, what happens if we leave them there and they get like triggered, right? What happens if they, somebody enters the ecology and things change? Shouldn't we take them out on that risk, right? But the question they seem to be raising here is, well, how is that even possible, right? Like, well, what could happen to do that? In this sense, they're not trying to say that there's a problem. They're almost problematizing the problematic in that sense. They're trying to unpack the very things that make that question and ultimately that move possible.
Yeah, and one thing I want to go back to is when they say the question to be asked is whether schizophrenics are the living machines of a dead labor, which are then constructed to the dead machines of living labor as organized in capitalism. So, we're talking about dead drives, and in contrast, we could talk about life drives, and the negative versus the positive. And I think that's a really nice, really short way to understand how all the schizophrenic are actually production of a dead world into a reach for life, or a reach for sense, or a reach for meaning. And as the labor is being created as as a negative within capitalism.
He marks the point where social, technical, and desiring machine comes together. To me, that line, the idea that this young man who couldn't exist inside of the social machines without falling apart and breaking, is able to produce and play around with let's say he's building a fucking car. He's able to build a car, be productive without any social pressure outside for other things. He's able to do it for the sake of doing it. And that machine is a machine unto itself. They talk about it, they say the line, they form desiring machines for which they are already the index in their own regime. That he's doing this act, he wants to do this thing, he is doing this thing, and he's building a thing, all sort of ensconced inside of its own regime, without having to be part of some larger, well, I'm doing this because I need to make money for my wife, or because I'm trying to gain fame. He's doing it for itself. And there's a beauty in that act that they're really driving at, and I really attach to myself.
I think also part of what they're saying in this last sentence is the idea of like they talk about in A Thousand Plateaus, like the idea of the nomad defines its own space. And one of the examples they give for that is like a fractal curve, like the dimension of like a space filling curve is fractional, and it's sort of defined by the curve itself. And I think that that's like something they come back to often about just the nature of like the authentic definition of space. And I think that that's what they're talking about with the artistic projects and scientific projects that define their own regime.
All right. Any last comments?
Oh, just to play off that, and through an interpenetration, right, through a communication. But yeah, I like how you phrased that.
Definitely. Last paragraph. Is everyone just excited as I am?
Hell yeah, let's do this.
What finally is the opposition between schizoanalysis and psychoanalysis when the negative and positive tasks of schizoanalysis are taken as a whole? We constantly contrasted two sorts of unconscious, or two interpretations of the unconscious. The one schizoanalytic, the other psychoanalytic. The one schizophrenic, the other neurotic Oedipal. The one abstract and non-figurative, the other imaginary. But also the one really concrete, the other symbolic. The one machinic, the other structural. The one molecular, microphysical, and micrological. And the other molar, or statistical. The one material, the other ideological. The one productive, the other expressive. We have seen how the negative task of schizoanalysis must be violent, brutal, defamiliarizing, de-Oedipalizing, decastrating, undoing theater, dream, and fantasy, decoding, deterritorializing, a terrible curettage, a malevolent activity. But everything happens at the same time, for at the same time the process is liberated, the process of desiring production, following its molecular lines of escape that already define the mechanics task of the schizoanalyst. And the lines of escape are still full molar or social investment at grips with the whole social field, so that the task of schizoanalysis is ultimately that of discovering, for every case, the nature of the libidinal investments of the social field, their possible internal conflicts, their relationships with the preconscious investments of the same field, their possible conflicts with these. In short, the entire interplay of the desiring machines and the repression of desire. Completing the process and not arresting it, not making it turn about or in the void, not assigning it a goal, will never go too far with the deterritorialization, the decoding of flows. For the new earth, in truth, the earth that will one day become a place of healing, is not to be found in the neurotic or perverse reterritorializations that arrest the process, assign it goals. It is no more behind than ahead. It coincides with the completion of the process of desiring production. This process that is always and already complete as it proceeds, and as long as it proceeds. It therefore remains for us to see how, effectively, simultaneously, these various tasks of schizoanalysis proceed.
Congratulations, people. We've one thing about the series of defamiliarize and stuff. There's one term that is missing here. It's defallicize, like to defallitize, and I think that would be important because it opens up to a whole feminist criticism also of the world. So this is missing into the English version, but in French it's there.
There's more missing. We are celebrating that we're through. But if you look in any French edition that I found, or any other translation than the English translation, there actually exists an appendix to Anti-Oedipus. In English, I think it was published in one of Guattari's solo collections.
Yes, this is true. The appendix is called the program for a desiring machine. So there's a program. There's something follows with the program.
There you go. Just as soon as we had our goal in sight, it is gone. So now we have the full explanation of that.
And we will be reading other things. But for now, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this extraordinary journey. We are not done yet. We have a handful of things we are going to be doing going on. We're going to be reading other books. We're going to be continuing AO, which is hilarious. We're going to be doing so much more. But just thank you all. I want to say thank you, because the last 9 months of my life have been dedicated to this, which is weird. So it's super surreal to kind of be finishing at the end of the year. I promised I'd try to finish it by the end of the year. I could not have cut it closer, so there we go. Thank all of you very much for joining. This has been a journey.